The first image seared into my ex-husband's memory that night was a black Suburban, its headlights extinguished, sliding like a ghost across his gravel driveway. The second thing he saw was me stepping out of the vehicle. I wasn't the version of the woman he thought he had known for 32 years. I wasn't the quiet wife who apologized for existing, nor the woman he habitually interrupted at the dinner table. I certainly wasn't the timid grandmother who worked part-time at a small bookstore near the Norfolk Marina. That night, Richard watched in stunned silence as 6 armed men stepped out behind me, their movements synchronized and lethal, waiting for my signal. When one of them turned to me with practiced deference, his voice steady, the reality shifted forever. "Commander Mercer, the perimeter is secure." The color drained from Richard's face instantly. I can still see the way his whiskey glass trembled in his grip before it slipped, shattering against the porch railing. But it was his voice that stayed with me, thin, fragile, and laced with a fear I had never seen in him. "Linda," he whispered. Who are you?" 12 minutes earlier, I had been driving home from Richard's lake house, reeling from yet another agonizing family dinner. The road winding along the Chesapeake was swallowed by the evening's gloom. Most people my age avoid these back roads after sunset, but I've never been bothered by the dark. After 25 years attached to Navy SEAL operations, the shadows often felt more like home than the daylight ever did. Richard never knew that. Nobody did. Well, almost nobody. Rain tapped a rhythmic, soft cadence against the windshield of my old Ford pickup as I headed north toward Norfolk. The radio was a low hum of Patsy Cline, barely audible over the wind. My hands were steady on the wheel, though my chest still burned from the casual humiliations of the evening. Richard had been drinking again. He wasn't the falling down type. He was far too controlled for that. He preferred the kind of intoxication that loosened his tongue without slowing his mind to the most dangerous level of all. Our daughter, Emily, had invited us both to dinner because her fiancé, Daniel, was visiting from Richmond. Even at 28, Emily still clung to the hope that her parents might one day learn to occupy the same room without a Cold War erupting. God bless her for trying. The evening had begun with a fragile politeness pot roast, biscuits, and mundane chatter about mortgage rates and the Navy football team's prospects. Then, inevitably, Richard turned his sights on me. "You know, your mother still jumps every time a car backfires," he told Daniel with a smug grin. "She's been terrified of loud noises since the Reagan administration." Daniel chuckled, a polite but hollow sound. Emily looked down at her plate, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I simply continued eating, my face a mask of practiced neutrality. Richard leaned back, savoring his audience. "Truth is, Emily, your mother spent most of our marriage afraid of her own shadow." It was a lie, of course. But if you repeat a version of someone often enough, people eventually stop looking for the truth. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin and offered a thin, soft smile. "You always did enjoy a good story, Richard." "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "I'm just joking." Joking? That was the word men of Richard's generation used like duct tape, a quick fix to cover the damage they had no intention of actually repairing. Emily moved the conversation along, ever the peacemaker, but as the night wore on, I noticed things. I saw the flashes of Daniel's temper, the way his knuckles whitened around his fork when Emily mentioned a job lead in North Carolina. I noticed the way he spoke for her, and the way Emily glanced at him before she dared to open her mouth, as if she were checking the barometer before stepping into a storm. I noticed because women of my era have learned to see the things younger women haven't yet learned to fear. And I noticed because for 25 years, spotting those minute shifts in atmosphere was what kept people alive. When I left, Emily hugged me by the truck. She held on a few seconds longer than usual. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said, her smile too quick, her eyes looking far too tired for a woman her age. As I pulled away, instinct, that old, dormant beast, whispered that something was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't a roar, just a low hum in the base of my skull. That's the thing about military training. It never truly leaves your bones. Even after retirement, through the onset of arthritis and the graying of hair, you learn to trust your discomfort. I was halfway home when my phone buzzed in the center console. A single text from Emily. 4 words. Blue Harbor, no sunrise. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my joints ached. 30 years of civilian life evaporated in a single heartbeat. To anyone else, those words were gibberish. But when Emily was 8 years old, I had taught her a coded distress phrase, not because I expected her to be in a war zone, but because I understood a truth civilians often ignore. Panic scrambles the brain. Fear makes you forget how to speak, but a practiced phrase, a mantra, will survive the chaos. Blue Harbor, no sunrise. It meant, I am in danger. I cannot speak freely. Come now. I pulled onto the shoulder so hard that gravel hammered against the undercarriage. My heart rate remained steady, a cold, clinical rhythm. Training. Always the training. I tried her phone, nothing. Voicemail. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Richard used to mock me for it, calling it my little senior citizen planner. Inside were numbers I hadn't dialed in a decade. Men and women who owed me favors. People who understood the weight of a word. I dialed the first one. A voice, thick with sleep but sharpening instantly, answered. "This is Harris." "It's Mercer," I said, my voice dropping into a register I hadn't used in years. There was a beat of silence then. "Report." My daughter sent the emergency phrase. She's at her father's lake house. I gave him the address. "Understood. 12 minutes, Harris replied. No questions, no hesitation. "No, are you sure?" That is the language of operators. I threw the truck into a hard U-turn, the tires fishtailing on the slick asphalt. As I drove, the Linda the world knew began to dissolve. The bookstore clerk, the shy ex-wife, the grandmother, they fell away mile by mile. My posture straightened, my breathing leveled out, and my mind became a tactical map. By the time I reached the county road, I wasn't just remembering my instincts, I was inhabiting them. As I approached the property, the house was ablaze with light. I could see silhouettes through the windows, one pacing aggressively, one standing perfectly still. Then, the cavalry arrived. 2 black SUVs appeared in my rear view, pulling in with muffled precision. One blocked the exit, the other pulled up alongside my Ford. Tom Harris stepped out of the passenger side. He was older now, his hair a shock of silver, but his shoulders were still broad, his eyes still scanning the horizon. 20 years ago, he'd run logistics for the classified operations I coordinated overseas. Now, he ran a veterans outreach group that did much more than just outreach. "You armed?" he asked quietly as he approached. "No." "Good. Local sheriff is 3 minutes out. We keep this clean." I nodded. Real operations aren't like the movies. They are about discipline and avoiding unnecessary tragedies. "Threat level?" Harris asked. "My daughter used the code. That's all the intel I need." A younger man, a former Marine by the looks of him, stepped forward with a medical bag. "Commander Mercer," he said with a nod of genuine respect. "We have thermal movement. 3 subjects inside. 1 is highly agitated." Hearing that title again sent a strange chill through me, but I didn't let it linger. My eyes were on the house. Richard's Lake House, a place meant for peace, now looked like a kill box. I started toward the porch. I could hear raised voices, then the unmistakable sound of something heavy smashing against a wall. My stomach twisted. "Emily," I whispered. Harris moved to intercept me. "The sheriff wants us to wait for a formal entry. If he hurts her while we're waiting for a signature, Tom, that paperwork won't mean a damn thing." He looked at me for a split second, then sighed. "Still the scariest woman I ever served with." As we reached the wooden steps, Richard's voice boomed from inside, frantic and high-pitched. "For God's sake, son, put the gun down." The world turned to ice. One of Harris's men spoke into his comms. "Firearm confirmed." Another crash. Then Emily screamed a sharp, desperate sound that tore through my composure. In that moment, I wasn't an operator. I was a mother. "Go," Harris signaled. The front door was breached with a force that rattled the foundation. "Sheriff's Department, hands up!" they shouted, providing the necessary legal cover even before the deputies arrived. We flooded the room. It was chaos. A lamp lay shattered on the hardwood. Whiskey was pooled everywhere. Daniel was backed against the fireplace, his hands shaking as he gripped a revolver. Emily was pressed against the kitchen counter, trembling, her face wet with tears. Richard stood to the side, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Daniel looked at the tactical team in utter confusion. He wasn't a professional. He was just a weak man who had finally snapped. "What the hell is this?" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Daniel," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a blade, "put the weapon down." He stared at me, trying to reconcile the woman who had served him pot roast 2 hours ago with the woman standing before him now. "You stay out of this," he spat. Behind me, one of the men spoke into his radio. "Commander Mercer is inside the residence. Status: negotiating." Richard's expression changed then. I watched the gears turn as disbelief gave way to a cold, hard realization. "Commander?" he repeated, his voice barely a breath. "Daniel," I continued, ignoring Richard entirely. "You're scared, you're embarrassed, and you're angry. But if you raise that weapon one more inch, this night ends in a way you won't survive." I kept my voice devoid of emotion. No threats, just absolute certainty. "Set the gun on the floor. Now, then sit down." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rain against the glass and the ticking of the grandfather clock. Finally, the tension left Daniel's body. The revolver thudded onto the rug. He was tackled and secured instantly as Emily collapsed into my arms. "Mom, you came," she sobbed into my shoulder. "I've got you, sweetheart, you're safe." Over her shoulder, I looked at Richard. He looked small. For the first time in 30 years, the man who had spent a lifetime trying to dominate me was utterly speechless. 3 days later, Emily came to stay with me in my modest apartment in Norfolk. It was a simple place above a bait shop, smelling of old books and salt air. Having her there changed the silence of my life. I heard her pacing at 2 a.m., the sound of her grief muffled by bathroom doors. I didn't push. Trauma has its own timeline. One evening, over tea, she finally asked the question. "Mom, who are you, really?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I went to the hallway closet and pulled out a heavy green footlocker. I laid the contents out on the kitchen table: photographs of sunburned men in desert flight suits, commendation plaques, and challenge coins worn smooth by years of worry. Emily picked up a photo of me in full tactical gear in Afghanistan, circa 2004. "This is you. You look different. You look dangerous." People disappear into ordinary life all the time, Emily. The woman at the grocery store might have carried secrets that could topple governments. America is full of invisible histories. I told her about meeting Richard in 1981. I was already deep into naval intelligence, coordinating for special warfare units. He was charming and loud, a man who filled the room. I loved that about him because I was already becoming sealed off by my work. Secrecy becomes an instinct. Silence becomes a cage. "He thought I didn't trust him," I explained softly. "The truth was, I was protecting him. Legally, I couldn't tell him. Emotionally, I didn't know how." "But he mocked you," she said, her voice tight. "My whole life, he made those jokes about you being scared of everything." He came from a generation where teasing was the only way to communicate. To him, my silence was weakness. To me, his loudness was a liability. I showed her a photo from 1993, taken on a carrier deck in the Persian Gulf. I was standing with 3 men. Only one of them was still alive. "You've been carrying all this alone," Emily whispered, looking at me not as a mother, but as a person. "Most veterans of my era do. We were taught endurance before vulnerability. You bury the grief, you bury the trauma, until you turn 60, and those things start clawing their way back to the surface." "I thought you were afraid," she said. I was. Every single day. She looked confused. I reached across the table and took her hand. Being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid, Emily. It means you've learned to function while carrying the weight of it. It means you keep your head when everyone else is losing theirs. She started to cry then, mourning the father she thought she knew and the mother she had never truly seen. Word traveled fast through the coastal towns. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the shift in how people treated me. The cashier was more respectful. The men at the marina nodded to me with a new kind of recognition. Richard was taking it hard. He'd stopped going to his usual diner because his friends wouldn't stop ribbing him about being married to G.I. Jane for 3 decades without knowing it. "Are you glad he finally got exposed?" Emily asked me one afternoon. At my age, revenge is a bitter flavor. I didn't want him destroyed, Emily. I just wanted him awake. Richard had spent his life believing that strength was about volume and control. He never understood that the most powerful person in the room is often the one who says the least. "Daniel reminded me of Dad sometimes," Emily admitted, her voice small. "The little jokes, the way I started changing how I spoke just to keep him from getting angry." "I know that feeling well," I replied. "You were terrified that night, weren't you?" I looked out at the water, remembering the moment I stepped through that door. Absolutely terrified. But you looked so calm. That's the secret, Emily. Calm isn't the absence of fear, it's the mastery of it. Training taught me how to breathe when the world is screaming. It taught me that when things are at their worst, you don't raise your voice, you lower it. But those hard-learned lessons came at a steep price. When you spend years suppressing every emotion for the sake of operational security, you eventually lose the ability to express them in your personal life. That was the slow poison that killed my marriage. Both Richard and I mistook my emotional survival mechanisms for coldness or personality flaws. A few days later, Emily talked me into attending a Sunday lunch at her Aunt Carol's house. I almost declined. At my age, family gatherings following a major revelation can be exhausting. Everyone looks at you through a new lens, trying to solve you like a puzzle, but I went for Emily. The moment I stepped into Carol's dining room, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a cold silence, just a brittle, careful kind of quiet, the way people behave when they aren't sure who you are anymore. Carol hugged me tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "Linda, honey, why didn't you ever tell us all this?" I gave her the same answer I'd been giving everyone else. It wasn't something I talked about. Richard arrived 20 minutes later, alone. He looked older than he had just 2 weeks prior, not just physically, but spiritually. He had the hollowed-out look of a man carrying the sudden weight of having to reconsider his entire life. When our eyes met across the room, he hesitated for a heartbeat before walking over. "Linda." "Richard." An awkward silence followed. 32 years of marriage, 12 years of divorce, and suddenly we were speaking like distant co-workers. Then, something unexpected happened. Richard reached out and pulled out my chair at the dining table before taking his own seat. It was a tiny, old-fashioned gesture, But in all our years together, he had rarely noticed such things. Emily noticed too. I could tell by the softening of her expression. Lunch moved at a sluggish pace. We navigated the usual southern spread potato salad, ham biscuits, and sweet tea while sticking to safe, familiar topics. That was until Carol's husband asked me quietly, "So, what exactly did you do in the Navy?" I offered a polite, practiced smile. "Mostly paperwork and logistics." Richard surprised everyone by speaking up. "No," he said softly. "It was more than that." The entire table fell silent, turning toward him. He looked directly at me as he continued. "You don't get men like that showing up in 12 minutes for paperwork." No one answered. Richard swallowed hard, his voice dropping an octave. "I think I spent a lot of years misunderstanding my wife. Not ex-wife, wife." The word caught us both off guard. I looked down at my plate, my vision blurring as my eyes began to burn. Age makes emotions stranger. You spend decades building an armor of hardness, and then suddenly, a small kindness hits you with the force of artillery. After lunch, Richard caught me near the driveway, while the others were inside clearing the dishes. The autumn wind was picking up, carrying the scent of pine needles and the cold breath of the lake. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I studied him. For once in his life, Richard looked truly uncertain. And perhaps, I realized, that was the beginning of wisdom. 3 months passed before Richard finally said everything he needed to say. Life had settled into a quieter, more predictable rhythm after the incident at the lake house. Daniel had accepted a plea agreement involving unlawful firearm possession and criminal intimidation. Emily was in counseling twice a week and was slowly beginning to sound like herself again. She laughed more, slept better, and started making plans for the future instead of constantly apologizing for taking up space within it. As for me, I returned to my quiet life at the bookstore near the marina. Most mornings, I unlocked the front door around 9, brewed a pot of cheap coffee in the back office, and began the meditative task of stacking history books. I liked the routine. Older Americans understand this deeply. After you've survived enough chaos, ordinary peace becomes sacred. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was pricing used hardcovers when my phone rang. It was Emily. Her voice sounded strained, vibrating with a familiar tension. "Mom? What is it? What happened?" My stomach tightened immediately. "It's Dad. He had a heart attack this morning." For a second, the bookstore vanished. It wasn't because I was still romantically in love with Richard that chapter had closed long ago. But you don't spend 32 years with someone without their heartbeat becoming permanently tethered to your own nervous system. "Is he alive?" I asked quietly. "Yes, a mild one. They caught it early." I closed my eyes, a wave of relief washing over me. I grabbed my coat and keys without another word. The drive to Chesapeake General took 20 minutes under a low gray sky. Rain streaked across the windshield while old memories rose uninvited. Richard teaching Emily to ride a bike. Richard grilling burgers in the backyard. Richard laughing so hard during a camping trip that beer came out of his nose. It's funny what survives a divorce. It's never the legal paperwork or the arguments. It's just these fragments of humanity. By the time I reached the cardiac floor, Emily was waiting outside his room, clutching a paper cup of cold coffee. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded weakly. "He keeps asking if you came." That hit me harder than I expected. Inside the room, Richard looked smaller. Hospital beds have a way of shrinking a person. The machines hummed a steady rhythm beside him, and the afternoon rain blurred the windows. He looked up when I entered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, he offered a tired, pale smile. "Well," he murmured, "guess the old engine finally complained." I pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "You scared Emily." I scared myself. His voice was weaker than I had ever heard it. Age humbles men eventually, sometimes through wisdom, and sometimes through biology. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Finally, Richard looked at me directly. "I've been thinking about us." That sentence could have meant 10,000 different things. I kept my expression calm, but he saw through it. He swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "I think I spent most of our marriage competing with someone who wasn't even fighting me." I said nothing, because he was right. "You know," he continued, "all those years, part of me knew something didn't add up about you. You were too calm. Every crisis, every emergency, every terrible thing life threw at us, you never panicked." I looked down at my hands. "That wasn't always healthy, Richard." "No," he admitted, "but back then I didn't understand quiet strength. I thought strength had to be loud. That's the truth, Linda. I thought being the loudest person in the room meant I was in charge." The honesty in his voice hurt more than any of his past cruelties. Cruelty can be dismissed, but regret is a heavy thing to witness. "When you wouldn't argue back, I thought I was winning," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Turns out you were just more disciplined than me." Somewhere down the hallway, a nurse laughed softly. Life continuing around old grief. "I mocked you," Richard whispered, "because deep down, I think your calm scared me." That confession settled heavily between us. I thought about the years of sarcastic remarks, the family dinners, the tiny humiliations disguised as humor. Suddenly, I felt a surge of sadness, not for myself, but for him. I finally understood. Richard belonged to a generation of men taught that vulnerability was a terminal weakness. They carried mortgages, wars, and family pressures without the emotional language to process any of it. So they joked, they controlled, they dominated. Not because they were monsters, but because they were emotionally unequipped. The realization didn't erase the pain, but it explained it. "I wasn't easy to live with either," I admitted quietly. He looked genuinely shocked. "Linda, you were the easiest person." "No," I interrupted gently. "I was emotionally absent half the time. The military trained me to compartmentalize everything: fear, trauma, grief. Eventually, I started compartmentalizing my marriage too. Richard's eyes lowered. You never let me in. I didn't know how. That was the most honest thing I had said in years. We sat in the quiet for a long time. Then, Richard let out a weak, dry laugh. What? I asked. You know the crazy part? All those years I thought I married a timid woman. I raised an eyebrow. And instead, he whispered, tears filling his eyes, I married the bravest person I ever met. My throat tightened. At 62, compliments land differently than they do at 25. You hear the weight of the years behind them. I'm sorry, Linda, he said. It wasn't a defensive or performative apology. It was just old and sincere. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small just so I could feel big. I looked at him for several seconds, then reached over and took his hand. His fingers trembled slightly against mine. I know, I whispered. For the first time in over 30 years, the silence between us felt peaceful instead of lonely. A year later, life was quieter than I ever imagined it could be. At my age, you stop measuring happiness by excitement, you measure it by peace. Peace was coffee on the balcony. Peace was Emily calling just to chat instead of crying. Peace was sleeping through the night without old memories dragging me awake at 3 a.m. Some wounds never fully disappear, but they eventually stop bleeding. Emily moved into a small townhouse near Raleigh after accepting a position counseling women recovering from emotionally abusive relationships. When she first told me about her work, I sat in silence for a long time. Turns out, she told me one evening, a lot of women don't recognize emotional control until someone older puts a name to it. That's true, I said. I wish I'd understood that sooner. I smiled into the phone. Most of us wish that about something, honey. Richard changed, too. After recovering, he began volunteering at a veteran support center. Mostly, he helped older vets fill out benefit paperwork or drove them to medical appointments. At first, I suspected guilt was his motivator, and maybe it was, but over time, he started listening. Really listening. He called me one afternoon, sounding thoughtful. You know how many Vietnam guys never talk about anything? They just sit there drinking terrible coffee, acting like everything is fine. Then one small thing cracks open, and suddenly they're carrying 50 years of grief. I know, I said softly. I think our generation confused endurance with healing, he said. That sentence stayed with me. Americans over 60 understand this better than most. We were raised by survivors, Depression-era parents and World War II fathers who buried their pain beneath routine. You worked, you endured, you stayed quiet. But silence has a cost. Sometimes that cost is a marriage, or a lifetime of loneliness. By early autumn, Emily convinced both Richard and me to attend a barbecue at her new place. I almost declined, not because things were hostile, but because large gatherings are exhausting. But Emily insisted. No drama, Mom. Just family. So, on a cool Saturday, I drove south with a bowl of potato salad balanced in the passenger seat, the unofficial uniform of every American woman over 60. The barbecue was wonderfully ordinary. Children ran through sprinklers, men talked football, and the smell of charcoal filled the air. No tactical teams, no secrets, just people trying their best. At one point, I was sipping iced tea when some of Emily's coworkers introduced themselves. Richard was nearby, talking to a neighbor. "So, how do you all know each other?" the neighbor asked casually. Before I could answer, Richard spoke up. "This is Linda Mercer," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the patio. My stomach tightened instinctively, but Richard just looked at me with a faint, proud smile. "She spent 25 years protecting people like us." The conversation around us quieted for a second. I felt the heat rise in my face. Public attention still made me uncomfortable. "Military?" one of the younger women asked in surprise. I nodded once. "Navy," Richard added. There were no jokes, no sarcasm, and no mockery. Just respect. And somehow, that simple moment healed a part of me I hadn't realized was still wounded. Not because I needed the praise, but because after decades of misunderstanding, Richard finally saw me clearly. That evening, Emily and I walked through her neighborhood as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pale purple. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you were?" she asked. I smiled. The answer had evolved over the years. At first, it was duty. Then, it was habit. Then, it was armor. "Because real strength isn't about making people fear you," I said gently. "It's about making the people you love feel safe." She slipped her arm through mine, just like she used to when she was little. As we walked, I realized something that had taken me a lifetime to grasp. Almost everyone is fighting a battle you cannot see. The quiet man at the diner, the difficult woman at church, the spouse who jokes too much, the mother who seems distant. We judge behavior while remaining blind to history. Sometimes the greatest tragedy in a family isn't cruelty, it's simply misunderstanding. If this story reminds you of someone in your own life, a veteran, a parent, or someone you've misjudged, I hope you'll reach out to them while there is still time. Sometimes healing begins with a single, honest conversation, and often, the people who seem the quietest have been carrying the heaviest burdens all along.